Not one of them survived. That fact sits there quietly, and then it starts to press on you. 23 men drove blades into Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Men of the Senate, men of Rome's oldest families, men who had been educated in philosophy, who could recite Plato by lamplight and argue constitutional theory over wine. Men who believed, with iron conviction, that what they were doing was not murder. It was surgery. Remove the infected limb, save the body. Go home, heroes. Every single one of them was dead within 14 years. Not as heroes, not in their beds surrounded by grandchildren. They died hunted, isolated, abandoned by the republic they claimed to worship. Some at their own hands, some at the hands of strangers, and at least one killed in a foreign city by men he had never met, who did not even need to look him in the eye to do it. The story mainstream history tells you about the Ides of March tends to end with a body on a marble floor and a dramatic quote. What it skips is everything that came after. The part where every man who raised a blade in that chamber discovers, one by one, that they had not liberated Rome. They had sentenced themselves. This is the full accounting. What happened to each of them, specifically, down to the last one standing. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Thousands of people across every continent come here for the history that doesn't get cleaned up, and I genuinely want to know where you are. Now, let's go back. The morning of March 15th began with omens nobody believed. Caesar's wife Calpurnia had screamed herself awake in the night. Augurs reported the wrong kind of entrails. A soothsayer had already spoken the warning in public, and Caesar had walked past him. None of it stopped anything. Because the men inside that plot had stopped believing in signs. They believed in themselves, in the sharpness of their argument and the sharpness of their blades. There were approximately 60 senators who knew something about the conspiracy in some form. The number who actually drove iron into Caesar's body is harder to pin precisely. Ancient sources record 23 wounds, but list anywhere from 20 to 30 participants. What we know with certainty is the core ring, the men who planned it, organized it, and stood close enough to Caesar to draw blood. Those are the men this story is about, and not a single one of them escaped what they had set in motion. Gaius Trebonius died first, and the manner of his death set the tone for everything that followed. Trebonius had not stabbed Caesar directly. His role was more clinical. He was the man assigned to intercept Mark Antony at the entrance to the Curia, to hold the most dangerous man in Rome in easy, distracted conversation, while the others worked inside. It required nerve and charm in equal measure. He executed it perfectly. He walked Antony away from the door. He smiled. He chatted. He kept him there until it was done. Then he walked back in to join the others, standing over the body. For that collaboration, he was rewarded with the governorship of Asia. He crossed the Aegean and took up his post, likely believing distance and a legitimate title would insulate him. He was wrong about both. Within months, a young and savagely ambitious Roman officer named Dolabella swept into the province with armed men. Dolabella had positioned himself as an avenger of Caesar, and Trebonius was the nearest target. He did not receive a trial. He did not receive a clean execution. Dolabella's soldiers subjected him to prolonged torture through the night. By morning, his head had been removed, and then soldiers did something with it that defied any definition of military dignity, kicking it through the streets of the provincial city like an object. A former consul of Rome, reduced to a toy for bored legionaries in a foreign alley. He had been dead less than a year after Caesar. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus took longer to die, and his end came wrapped in a particular cruelty, because Decimus was arguably the man most personally responsible for Caesar walking into that chamber at all. He was Caesar's trusted general, a man Caesar had mentioned in his will. The conspirators knew that Caesar's suspicion was sharpening in those final days, that he might not come to the Senate at all. So they sent Decimus. He knocked on Caesar's private door that morning, sat with him, and told him calmly, warmly, that the omens were superstition and the Senate was waiting, and his dignity would suffer if he hid from bad dreams. He walked Caesar to his death with the practiced ease of a man who had shared his table 100 times. After the assassination collapsed into chaos, Decimus tried to hold his province in northern Italy. He moved troops. He wrote letters to Cicero. He tried to look like a force of order in a world that was rapidly choosing sides against him. When the political landscape shifted completely, he pushed north through the Alps, trying to reach Brutus and Cassius in Macedonia. He never came close. A Gallic tribal chieftain named Camillus intercepted him somewhere in the region we now call Burgundy, a man who had made his own calculation about which way the power was flowing and whose gratitude was worth having. On Antony's direct orders, the general who had personally escorted Julius Caesar to his death was executed in a field. No monument, no record of last words. Gone. The man who struck the very first blow died differently. Publius Servilius Casca Longus had been seated closest to Caesar when the moment came. He made the opening cut, a strike to the neck that was not clean, that did not kill, that only startled and wounded, and caused Caesar to spin around and grab at his arm. The room exploded after that. The others converged, but Casca had been the one to shatter the silence, to go from conspirator to killer in the time it takes to extend an arm. He fought in the campaigns that followed. He was present at both engagements at Philippi. After the second battle destroyed Brutus's army, Casca did not wait to be captured. He had driven iron into Caesar with his own hands. He understood what capture meant. He took his own life in the aftermath. No recorded final words, no theatrical gesture. He ended himself before someone could do it for him. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the architect of the entire conspiracy, the mind that assembled the network and chose the day and positioned every man, died on a misunderstanding. That fact is almost impossible to sit with. The coldest strategic intellect in Rome died because dust and distance made his own men look like enemies. At the first battle of Philippi, his camp had been overrun by Antony's veterans. He climbed a hill to assess the damage. He watched riders approaching a colleague he had sent to scout Brutus's position. He could not see clearly. He thought it was a capture. He turned to his freedman Pindarus and asked him to help end it. Ancient writers claim he used the same blade he had driven into Caesar 2 years earlier. Whether that detail is literal or symbolic, it is the kind of irony that history rarely invents. Minutes later, Titinius returned to the hill wearing a victory wreath, not a prisoner, a survivor bearing good news. When Titinius found Cassius dead on the ground, he reportedly took his own life beside him. Cassius had been wrong about everything he saw from that height. He was right about one thing: there was no world in which he was going to survive what he had started. Now, before we get to the deaths that cut deepest, the ones that reveal what it costs a man to live with this kind of weight pressing on him, I want to speak to you directly. If you are still here, you are not here by accident. You are the kind of person who cannot look away from the real story, the one underneath the official version. The lineage is where we go even deeper. No interruptions, no shortened investigations, just the full, uncompromising record. If this is your world, hit the join button now. Because what comes next does not get easier. Marcus Junius Brutus, the name that echoes loudest across 2,000 years. The one Shakespeare built a tragedy around. Brutus had hesitated during the attack. His blade found Caesar late, but in the hours after, his voice had been the loudest. He had stood on the steps and delivered the argument. He had walked through the streets with his dagger still wet, expecting a city to thank him. What he found was silence. He fled to Macedonia. He built an army on the strength of his name. He gave speeches that people traveled to hear. He recruited soldiers who believed in what he said, or at least in what he promised. Through all of it, something was consuming him from the inside that no argument could address. The night before the second battle at Philippi, Brutus sat alone in his tent by lamplight. The ancient sources, Plutarch, Appian, record what happened next without hesitation. A shape materialized in front of him. Vast, dark, wrong in its proportions. When Brutus asked it what it was, the figure told him, "Your evil spirit. We will meet again at Philippi." He told his most trusted men what he had seen. Then he walked out of the tent and led them into battle. When his army disintegrated in the second engagement, when formations broke and officers lost control, and thousands of men simply stopped being an army, Brutus retreated to a hill with a handful of men who refused to leave him. He asked his companions to help him die. Most refused. They could not raise a blade against the man they had followed across the sea. Finally, a soldier named Strato agreed to hold a sword steady. Brutus threw himself onto it. His last recorded words were about virtue, that he had loved it and lived for it his entire life. That now he discovered it was an empty word. Whether those were his precise syllables or a philosophical gloss applied by later writers, they capture something that cannot be argued away. Brutus had built his entire identity on the belief that a good man doing a necessary act would be recognized as good. Rome had not recognized him. The battlefield had not recognized him. The virtue he had killed for had saved nobody, including him. Antony found the body and ordered an honorable burial. He had despised Brutus. He had also known him before all of this. He could recognize courage even when its aim had been catastrophically wrong. Lucius Minucius Basileus never reached a battlefield. He was in the inner ring, present in the chamber, present at the act. After the assassination, as Rome turned hostile, he retreated to his estate. He had mistreated his slaves systematically and openly. The beatings accumulated over years, the humiliations compounded. And then the world outside his gates changed in ways that stripped away whatever protection his title had once provided. His slaves killed him. Not in the night, not quietly, in his own household, in an act that required coordination, which means they had waited and planned and chosen their moment. A man who had stabbed a dictator in the Senate died at the hands of people he had never thought to fear, because he had never thought of them as people at all. Gaius Cassius Parmensis was the last of them. He had been present in the inner circle without occupying the highest tier of notoriety, and that obscurity is precisely what bought him time. After Philippi, he attached himself to Sextus Pompey, the rogue naval commander who had turned the western Mediterranean into his personal territory. When Sextus was crushed, Cassius Parmensis pivoted again, joining Antony's forces in the east. He watched alliances collapse. He watched Antony's power shatter at Actium. He moved through the surviving margins of the Roman world like a man who understood that every connection was temporary and that the one person he needed to avoid had not forgotten him. He settled in Athens. He had been a poet once, before all of this. Some of his verses still circulated in educated Roman circles. In Athens, he could almost be a scholar again, a man of letters, a man who had made choices in his youth that he had perhaps spent a decade trying to rationalize. 14 years after the Ides of March, Octavian's agents found him there. No battle, no final speech. They killed him in Athens. And with that, the last man alive who had personally participated in the stabbing of Julius Caesar was gone. 14 years. That is the number that carries everything. Octavian had been 18 when they killed his adopted father. He was in his 30s, the unchallenged master of the known world, when Cassius Parmensis died in a foreign city. He had not forgotten a single name, not a single blade, not a single role. There is a coin minted by Brutus and Cassius that still exists today. It shows 2 daggers flanking a liberty cap, with the inscription Ides Mar, the Ides of March, struck in the East and handed to soldiers as proof that the assassination was not a crime but a cause. That coin was meant to be the founding document of a restored republic. Instead, it became a museum piece, something scholars handle carefully in gloves, studying what the men who made it believed they were beginning. They were not beginning anything. They were ending everything they had ever known, including themselves. The 23 wounds they carved into Caesar did not produce a republic. They produced an empire, and they produced their own deaths. Brutus and Cassius had warned Rome about one-man rule, and then By dismantling the only political class capable of resisting future power, they guaranteed it. They cleared the field for a successor more patient, more calculating, and more ruthless than Caesar had ever needed to be. Augustus ruled for 40 years and did not call himself a king. He did not need to. He had learned from the men who tried to kill the idea of kings and died, proving the idea was unkillable. Not one of them made it out. Not the architect, not the first blade, not the man who walked Caesar to his death with a warm smile, not the philosopher who believed virtue would shield him, not the poet who outlasted them all but could not outlast the memory of a teenager who had decided, at 18, that none of them would. They raised their daggers on the steps of the Curia and announced that Rome was free. 14 years later, the last of them died in Athens, and Rome had an emperor worshipped as the son of a god. If you made it here, you already know why this matters. The clean version gives you the assassination and moves on. The real version follows every man who raised that blade and shows you exactly where it led. Subscribe right now and hit the like button. That one action keeps these investigations alive and puts them in front of people who are ready for them. Send this to someone who thinks the Ides of March is just a Shakespeare quote and not a 14-year manhunt with no survivors. We are only getting started.